Ladies and gentlemen, my name is LJ Stambuk. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, and it is my privilege and honor today with all of you to provide a very warm Charlotte welcome to His Excellency Ambassador Arun Singh of India. Welcome to Charlotte. Thank you. Now, someone who is much, much better at this is going to talk in about a minute and provide an even better welcome to the ambassador. So, Mr. Ambassador will have two very warm welcomes for you for coming to Charlotte. That's the way it is here. So if you come back, we'll give you maybe even three welcomes. But thank you for being here with your staff. India is a country that all of us should know more about. We should visit the traditions, the history, the culture. Also, things that you might know or should know is that India had the fastest growing economy in the world last year at 7.8%. Think about it. The new Prime Minister was here in the US last year, and the relationship and friendship between the two countries that goes back so long is getting stronger every day. And it is my honor to invite to the podium the Mayor of Charlotte, Jennifer Roberts. Jennifer.
Good afternoon. It is great to see such a wonderful crowd here today to welcome and honor Ambassador Singh to Charlotte, his first visit. And it is also especially wonderful to see all the students and the young people here, because we want you to understand how global our city is, how global our state and our country are, and it is essential for your future and your success that you understand the United States' place in the world, Charlotte's place in the world, and how we are connected. And we are connected here in Charlotte so many ways to India. The largest democracy in the world. We are partners, we are allies, we are friends, we are trading partners, we have investment going both ways, and we have a thriving Indian American community right here in Charlotte that is contributing amazing things to our city. We have doctors, engineers, IT specialists, bankers, communications experts. We have professors. We have so many different areas of our community that are directly touched by citizens from India who are now becoming citizens of Charlotte. And we are a better community for that. And we hope, Mr. Ambassador, that you have many occasions to return to Charlotte. We'd love to have you come and open up some big new Indian company right here. We would welcome you to do that. And we know that we have people flying back and forth to India, to Charlotte all the time because our airport connections make that easy, and that we know that we want to continue to grow that as well. We appreciate your leadership in the world. We appreciate what the Indian culture has brought to us in everything from philosophy to the arts to dance and education, engineering, everything that we know is important for our future. So on behalf of the City of Charlotte, and we have 11 council members, on behalf of all of that leadership and also the 800,000 citizens who call Charlotte home, we give you a warm Southern welcome. And I have, let's give them the welcome. There we go. And if you don't mind, I'd like to present you a gift. If you can come up for a minute. This is a piece of pottery that has been fashioned by a local potter. And North Carolina is known for our pottery. We have this really dense clay that's really hard to dig in, but it makes really good pottery. And so on behalf of Charlotte, this is for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, LJ. Terrific.
The mayor has so eloquently conveyed the warmth and the goodwill of the people of Charlotte and its Indian American heritage and community to the mayor. It is my pleasure and my honor to introduce to you the Ambassador of India, Mr. Arun Kumar Singh. It is also a point of personal privilege for me because the ambassador was my professor in the very first economics course I took as an undergraduate. And I would like to think that you taught me well, Mr. Ambassador. From his early start in academia, Ambassador Singh joined the exclusive Indian Foreign Service and received his first assignment at the Indian Embassy in Moscow. That was the beginning of what has been a long and distinguished service with assignments and responsibilities dealing with some of the most challenging and intractable diplomatic issues for the country and indeed the world. After stints in Addis Ababa and Tokyo, he returned to New Delhi for high-level engagements with matters relating to Pakistan, and then proceeded to the United Nations, again to Moscow, and back to New Delhi, now dealing with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran, which were by then an arc of diplomatic and security turmoil after 9/11. For those who know him, it would come as no surprise that the government of India would entrust his foreign policy dialogues in that delicate and fraught situation and region to one of the most seasoned, mature, and articulate voices in its diplomatic infrastructure. Since then, Ambassador Singh has been repeatedly called upon to build, sustain, deepen, and push the frontiers of the Indian government's most important relationships, serving as its ambassador to Israel, as deputy chief of mission in Washington, D.C., and as ambassador to France before returning to Washington again as India's chief diplomat. I would like to note also that international relations, in a way, is a staple of the Singh household. The ambassador is married to Meena Chawla Singh, an academic and an expert on diaspora relations who has written authoritatively on American missionary women in South Asia, on the Indian Jewish people of Israel, and more recently of the Indian diaspora of France. I'm sure that an evening at the Singh dining table would be, would be occasion for some object lessons in international relations and diplomacy. Please join me in welcoming the Indian ambassador to the United States, His Excellency Arun Kumar Singh.
Thank you, Vikram, for that very, very generous introduction. I wish it were true, but it was good to hear it. Of course, it's good to be introduced by a former student, and it so happened that that was the first class that I had taken after I had graduated from university. And looking back, I can tell you that the best days in my life and career have been days as a teacher at the university, when you have 30 to 40 captive slaves listening to you. So I've been asked to speak for about 15-20 minutes, and then we do some question answers. So I'll limit my comments to that time frame, because I do find that the question answer session tends to be a little more interesting, especially after lunch, because otherwise just listening to somebody drone on can be challenges. When we are thinking about what subject to discuss, after some back and forth between us and the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, we decided to choose the theme of India and the United States, a critical global partnership for the 21st century. And I thought it was apt because at one level, this is a new relationship that is being developed. Because if you looked at the relationship between India and the US in the 1980s, 1990s, it was very different from the relationship that we have today. And the change, the transformation in the relationship really began in 2000, when President Clinton went to India. And before that, many of you might recall, following the nuclear tests that we had done in 1998, the US had led the processes to impose sanctions on India. But after that, there was a deep dialogue between India and the United States. And starting with President Clinton's visit, we were building a new relationship. This was taken further by President Bush when he decided to enter into a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with India. And this process was begun in 2005, completed in 2008. And this agreement has completely transformed the relationship between our two countries. It has done so because before that, the US led many multilateral export control regimes. The objective of much of that effort was also to deny high technology access to India. But once we did the civil nuclear power agreement, not only did it open the door for partnership in nuclear energy, but it opened the door for partnership across a whole range of technology sectors. And we are able to partner in high technology in different areas. And one solid example of what has happened as a result of the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, as many of you may have noticed or read, is that Westinghouse is engaged in deep conversation with the government of India to build 6 new nuclear power projects in India. And at the level at which new nuclear power construction is happening in the world, building 6 new nuclear power projects by one company in one country is a very significant effort. Of course, much still needs to be achieved. It is not yet a done deal, but there is deep discussion going on, and the discussions are fairly well advanced. Following the effort that President Bush had made, under President Obama again, things have been taken forward in a very significant way, reflecting the fact that now in the United States there is broad bipartisan support for the relationship. President Obama has been the first US president to visit India twice in his tenure. He was in India in 2010, he was in India in January 2015. Before that, President Bush had visited in 2006, President Clinton in 2000, and before that, President Carter in 1978. So you can see the transformation that is happening just by the periodicity and nature of these visits. And when President Obama visited in January last year, he was the first US president to have visited India on our national day, the Republic Day of India, which is very significant for us because that's the day that we gave to ourselves our constitution after we had become independent. And when we had done our constitution, we had looked at constitutions of different countries, including the US Constitution. And of course, we had adapted it to our own requirement. And yet it is significant that although the US is the world's oldest democracy, and we are the world's largest democracy, no US president till last year had gone to India on our Republic Day, the day we gave to ourselves our constitution, and when India rolls out its economic, political, and military might to capture the progress that has been made. Now, talking of India being the world's largest democracy, I just wanted to mention a few figures which sort of gives the context to this point. The size of the Indian electorate is about 830 million. So you take the electorate of the United States, electorate of Europe, electorate of Indonesia, and electorate of Brazil, still does not add up to the size of the Indian electorate. So it is with this size of electorate that we exercise our democratic functioning. And when we had the last general elections in India in May 2014, there was 70% voting. more than 550 million people exercised their vote. We had 1 million polling booths because there's a requirement in India that no Indian should need to walk more than a mile to get to a polling booth because not everybody can afford a vehicle. And in one polling booth in Gir forest area of Gujarat, there was a polling booth for one person, so he could exercise his right. And when we conducted the elections in May 2014, it was spread over a period of 3 to 4 weeks because we would concentrate the security forces in a particular area, hold the elections so that there was no interference with the exercise of the right to express your free choice in voting. But once we had completed this process and the counting began on a particular day, the trends were clear within a couple of hours. The results were known broadly within a couple of hours and definitively by the end of the day, because voting in India today is and has been now for several election cycles entirely 100% electronic. So even in the remotest parts of the country, people exercise their democratic right through the electronic voting machine. And therefore, in many ways, in terms of our electoral practices, it is at par with those among the most advanced countries in the world. I emphasize this point about democracy because today, given the uncertainty that the world sees in the political domain, with rising violence, activities by non-state actors, terrorism, policies geared towards exclusion, it is through democratic functioning that we believe that people in societies can find an avenue for legitimate expression of grievances, and therefore the norms that the US and India bring to bear in a global context in the framework of democracy are an important message to the world and an important element of our partnership. Another thing that brings the US and India closer together is the fact that if you look around the world, the two countries with maximum degree of multiculturalism and pluralism, they are India and the United States. In India, we have 22 official languages. Can you think of another country in the world that has 22 official languages? We have hundreds of other languages and dialects. So just in terms of languages, we are like a United States of Europe. And if you look at the religions that are present in India, all the major religions of the world have either emerged from India or found a welcome home in India. Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism emerged from India. Judaism, Islam, Christianity have found a welcome home in India. We have more than 800 million Hindus. We have more than 180 million Muslims in India. We are the second largest country in the world in terms of number of Muslims. Some say, well, only 2% of your population is Christian. But 2% in India means 25 million people. So it's larger than the population of many countries who define themselves as Christian. More than 2%, and we have several representatives of the Sikh community here, more than 2% of our population is Sikh, and that's more than 25 million people. I had served as India's ambassador to Israel, and we have about 80,000 Indian origin Jewish people in Israel. And when I used to interact with them, and Judaism has been present in India for more than 2,000 years. One of the Jewish communities in India derives their presence from the time between the first and the second temple. And they used to tell me that India was among the few, if not the only country in the world where there was never anti-Semitism. So it is in that framework of living in the midst of diversity as we grow up, diversity of religion, diversity of languages, that we bring our approach to global issues. And we say that our differences do not divide us, they define us. There is unity in our diversity. So, basing the relationship in this context, we have worked to expand our trade and investment relationship, our defense cooperation. Our bilateral trade now is $120 billion. It has grown 5 times in the last 15 years. For India, US is our largest trading partner, and it is also a broadly balanced trade relationship. Investment flows have increased in both directions. US investment in India is today estimated to be about $28 billion. But what is not very widely known, but also significant, is that in the last 5 years, Indian companies have invested $15 billion in the United States, creating 100,000 jobs directly, with a presence in more than 40 states. And then, of course, there's a lot of indirect job creation impact. Another area that I have noticed in terms of potential for partnership is in innovation. Many of you might recall that in September 2014, a US space vehicle reached the Mars. Within 1 week of that, an Indian space vehicle reached the Mars. And of course, using modern technology, they tweeted to each other. But 2 figures here are significant. And of course, the US space vehicle had far greater capacity. But still, the Indian space vehicle cost 1/10 the cost of the US space vehicle. And the cost of the Indian space vehicle at $65 million was less than the cost of a Hollywood movie dealing with space. So there is a lot of cost-effective R&D and development work happening in India. In course of my work, I've met CEOs of many companies in Israel, in France, and the United States, and they tell me that they are doing a certain amount of R&D and development work in India, not with a name just on the Indian market, but to remain globally competitive. GE, for example, has employs some 6,000 to 7,000 people in India doing just R&D and development work. They developed an ultrasound machine in India, which has been extremely cost-effective, and then they have used it to reach out to markets also in Africa and Latin America. Cisco, their CEO, once told me they developed a router in India, which after that they have marketed in other parts of the world, and they felt that that router could not have been developed in the United States because the researchers, developers in the US were looking at the problem from a different perspective. They wanted to maximize the quality of the experience. And in India, the whole approach was, how do you keep the cost down? How do you make sure it reaches the largest number of people? And we are relatively surplus in skilled manpower, relatively deficient in capital, and therefore we bring a different perspective and different approach to dealing with some of the technology issues. And that's why entities in the US and in India now find it very, very productive to partner with each other. And as everyone knows, the US is the world leader in innovation, including in digital technology. In September last year, I had the opportunity to travel several times to the West Coast, to Silicon Valley, Bay Area, and interact with people there because we were working on bringing on the visit of the Indian Prime Minister to California to see opportunities in this sector. And I could see for myself that Indian companies, Indian origin tech workers, Indian origin entrepreneurs were an integral part of the US global leadership in digital technology. And I'll just describe to you one event that we had organized, that the Prime Minister came and spoke to people about the vision he had for digital technology in India, because we want to do a lot in India now on the basis of digital technology. And so, but before he spoke, we had invited the CEOs of 5 companies to come and talk about the trends they saw in digital technology and what they were doing in India and what was the potential for further partnership between India and the US. And these were CEOs of Cisco, Qualcomm, Microsoft, Google, and Adobe. Now I'll tell you their names: John Chambers, Paul Jacobs, Satya Nadella, Sundar Pichai, and Shantanu Narayan. And you just look at that and you can see for yourself the integral linkages between Indian origin persons, Indian tech entrepreneurs, and US effort in digital technology. Today, there is tremendous energy in India in the startup sector. In the last 2 years, $6 billion have flowed into startups in India. Several unicorns have emerged from India. And entities based in Silicon Valley, in technology, finance, and other areas are an integral part of this effort happening in India. So I believe that going ahead, innovation, new technology, R&D, digital technology will be very important areas for partnership for us. Because in digital technology, it is disrupting business models. And we want to see how do we use digital technology in India to do things differently so that we don't have to necessarily follow the path that the United States followed or Europe followed. We economize use of resources and yet meet our needs. For example, in renewable energy, if we can use digital technology in some way, or use solar energy to bring about distributed power availability so that we don't have to lay the infrastructure the same way. Can we use digital technology in hospitality industry so that we go beyond the constraint of availability of hotel capacity to the needs, to the extent we need for the purposes of tourism? So these are some of the challenges we're looking at where there will be opportunity of partnership. And another area which I had referred to partly when I spoke about nuclear would be renewable energy. Because in India, we now want to expand renewable energy in a significant way. We believe that we have not contributed to the problem of global warming, because even today in India, our emissions are only 2 tons per capita. In the case of China, it's about 8 tons per capita. For developed countries, it is even higher. But we are facing the consequences of global warming. It is affecting our coastal areas, it is affecting weather patterns. And so going ahead, to the maximum extent possible, we want to do our growth on the basis of renewable energy. And so there's a huge plan for expansion of solar energy in India. Today, the availability of solar power is about 5 gigawatt. Government has said that by 2022, we want to take it to 100 gigawatt for solar and 175 gigawatt for renewable. And there is massive expansion in solar energy happening in India today. The cost of solar energy per unit of power has come down significantly. It was about 20 cents 3 years ago. It has come down to 7 cents. If it comes down another 2 or 3 cents, then there may not be a requirement of subsidy. And that will really facilitate expansion in this sector. Another area where we are putting emphasis, and I met some people here who are also involved in that, is in terms of smart cities. Today, we have 350 million Indians living in urban areas. The projection is that by about 2030, there will be almost 700 million Indians living in urban areas. So you can visualize the amount of expansion we need in terms of urban infrastructure, communication, roads, subway systems, transportation, education, healthcare. And that's why the government wants to put a lot of emphasis on the development of smart cities so that we economize on the use of resources and meet the needs of the people in these cities better. And based, in fact, on some of the earlier discussions that we had with Mr. Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, we worked out a scheme of competition through which 100 cities have been selected in the first phase. Through further competition among them, 5 cities have been selected as a start who will receive funding both from the federal government and their state government to start some of these projects. And the US government and US private sector is also involved in this process. The US TDA is funding some of the studies related to development of smart cities. And as I mentioned, several private sector entities have been involved. We have identified 3 cities in India, Visakhapatnam, Ajmer, and Allahabad, for partnership with the United States. With this growing confidence in our relationship, growing potential for the future, another area that has seen significant progress is our defense partnership. Because when you build the defense partnership, it is a reflection of growing confidence and also leads to further confidence. US has not been a traditional supplier of defense products to India. Yet in the last 5 years, we have contracted to buy $14 billion worth of defense supplies from the US. We have 10 C-17 aircraft, which is long-range transport aircraft. Now, the largest number of C-17s outside the United States are in India. The C-130 transport aircraft that we bought from the US, we used in earthquake relief when there was a massive earthquake in Nepal. We used in evacuation of people from Yemen when there was instability there. And we evacuated people from more than 40 countries. We also evacuated several US citizens at the request of US government from Yemen at that time. But now we have decided to move beyond just a buyer-seller relationship to co-production and co-development of defense technology. 2 projects that we are working on in identifying possibility of cooperation are aircraft carrier technology and jet engine technology. And if we make progress in those areas, I think it will really deepen our partnership. The US Defense Secretary, Mr. Carter, will be visiting India at the end of this week, and we'll have good discussion with his counterparts in India to explore some of these areas. Today, we do more military exercises with the United States than with any country in the world. And the US does more military exercises bilaterally with India outside NATO than it does with any country in the world. And this again is a reflection of the direction in which we are headed. But I believe what really provides the fundamental strength and basis to our partnership is the people-to-people dimension of the relationship. Because that's always a source of strength. And today we have about 3.5 million people of Indian origin in the United States. Many of them are present here. Given some of the professions they are in, let me just mention a few figures. There are some doctors here. We have 110,000 Indian origin doctors in the US serving in remote parts of this country. 1 out of 7 patients in the US is now seen by an Indian doctor. There were some people from the hotel industry. 40% of all hotels rooms in the US are now owned and managed by Indian Americans. And they generate about $13 billion of revenue, contributing huge amounts as taxes and social security contributions. Again, there are many people from universities, and I don't know whether it's a good figure or a bad figure, but it's a fact. We have about 150,000 Indian students in US universities for whom we are paying $4.5 billion annually just as tuition fees. And I'm not making up this figure. You multiply 150,000 by 30,000 and you get $4.5 billion. This is the figure that shows up in the trade statistics on services side between the 2 countries. And of course, these people then spend much more on other aspects. So let me stop here. I just wanted to give you a sense of the direction in which we are headed, the comprehensive nature of the relationship, and the potential for the future. And it is a critical partnership based on values as we deal with economic and political uncertainties in today's context. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Raj Bhardwaj. I'm with Wells Fargo and also serve on the World Affairs Council of Charlotte board. So I'm here to moderate the Q&A session with Ambassador Singh. Just to get us started, there are two mics, and so anyone who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand and make sure you speak into the mic. Briefly introduce yourself. Just to get started, Ambassador Singh, you did not touch upon the so-called demographic dividend that India enjoys the benefit of, given its age breakdown. So it also provides a challenge. So if you could kindly comment on that aspect. Thank you.
So, should we take 2 or 3 questions and then respond, or how do you?
Yeah, why don't
Let's
we?
take 2 or 3. Yeah.
That's a great. There might be some themes that emerge. Good point. Thank you.
Do you think that concerns in other emerging market economies such as Russia, China, and Brazil affect India?
Thank you, Ambassador Singh. It was great to hear from you. A question relates to India's efforts to secure a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. As you said, India probably is the home to 1/6 of humanity. And again, it's probably the world's 4th or 5th largest economy now. So you do have economic might as well as you have population, which is living under a democratic environment. What is keeping India back from being able to secure permanent membership in the UN Security Council? Where does the opposition lie? I know, you talked about the defense ties with the U.S., so naturally U.S. is supporting India's bid to that, but I know, it has not happened so far. There are oppositions. So I'd like to know, where is the opposition? What is the rationale of that opposition not letting India secure this seat, and what is India doing to overcome that?
Yeah, each one of those questions is very different, different domain. So starting with the demographic dividend, I think it's an important point that the rate of growth of population in India is about 1.5, 1.6%. And some years ago, one used to hear about high rate of population growth in India, etc. You don't hear that anymore, because people argue that 1.5, 1.6% is a sustainable rate of population growth. But although if you look at the numbers, at some stage, we need to plateau. Now, with this rate of population growth, one advantage is that the bulk of Indian population will remain in the working age bracket. So more than 60 to 65% of the population will remain in the working age bracket, even with projections 50, 60 years from now. So the kind of problems some societies are facing in terms of an aging society is not the problem that we are grappling with. Now, one positive aspect of that, which we talk to people, that if, let's say, companies in the US are looking at their manpower requirements 15 or 20 years from now, where will you find that technically trained manpower? You'll have to look at the technically trained manpower of India, because that's where these numbers would be available as you look at scaling up and as you look at it either in the economic sense or engineering sense. Therefore, it makes sense for US companies today to build their relationships with India, with the Indian economy, with the Indian technology, with the Indian skilled workforce, so that they can develop them in terms of their requirement 10 or 15 years down the line, because that's where they would be found and they would be available. So that's one dimension. In terms of challenge, because there is the positive dimension, but the challenge, you need to generate jobs for these people. And although we say it's a sustainable rate of growth, still we create one Australia every year. So our population goes up by about 18 or 19 million every year. And so you need to create jobs. So that's one of the challenges that the government has. So there is a demographic challenge, but there is a demographic dividend inherent in that, so long as we are able to do this process correctly. In terms of emerging market economies, not just the emerging market, but others also, in the present situation, we are facing global headwinds in terms of the economic processes. US is doing reasonably well, but Europe is stagnating. China is slowing down. Other emerging markets are not doing so well at the moment. Therefore, in terms of availability of market for our exports, there are limits. So those challenges are there, and those certainly would cause us concern. But we have huge unmet needs in India itself. And we grew by about 7% last year. Most projections are that this year the growth in India would be about 7.5%, and we would probably remain the fastest growing economy in the world. We are going to put in huge investment in infrastructure in India, in railways, in roads, ports, telecom. The projection is over the next 5 years, we will need $1 trillion worth of investment in infrastructure alone, aside from other areas. We have a huge program of Make in India to expand manufacturing in India. And we need it not just because of the numbers that I described, but also, as Vikram might recall, in the first classes that I taught him, most developing countries go from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services. In India, we went straight from agriculture to services. And today, agriculture contributes only 14% of our GDP, but 70% of our population is dependent on agriculture. The services sector contributes more than 60% of our GDP. And services is very good in value addition. But in some areas, in terms of employment generation, there can be a challenge. And I'll give you one example. Everybody talks about India's IT sector, where we've done reasonably well. The IT sector contributes 7% of our GDP and employs 3 million people. Agriculture, I told you, contributes 14% of our GDP and employs 700 million people. You can see immediately the difference in value addition and productivity. And therefore, going ahead, we have no option but to expand manufacturing in India for our own requirements, other than in terms of the global linkages. And therefore, that too will create opportunity in India. So we hope we will be able to deal with any headwinds that may come from the global growth trends or emerging market economy trends. In terms of the UN Security Council, very interestingly, when the United Nations was set up in 1945, India was an original signatory to the Charter of the United Nations, although we were still a colony at that time. Again, another very interesting fact I'll mention for you. At the end of the First World War, when the Treaty of Versailles was negotiated near Paris, there was an Indian delegation present there. Although we were colonized at that time, and there was an Indian delegation because Indian soldiers had fought in the First World War. And they had made tremendous sacrifices. A large number had been killed in battles in France and Belgium. Similarly, we were there at the setting up the United Nations. But because we were a colony, we were not given due recognition and space in terms of the structure of the UN. But so after some time, we made this point repeatedly that given India's size, population size, and other aspects, the contribution that we bring to global processes, India has a right to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. But given the Charter, there is a certain procedural requirement that all 5 permanent members of Security Council need to agree in some way, and 2/3 of the general membership of the United Nations needs to vote. And so there has been a debate going on about if there is to be an expansion of the Security Council, who should be the new permanent members. And so there is as yet no broad consensus in terms of not just India, but which are the other countries that could be brought into this. And that's still going on. But we've received tremendous support. When President Obama was in India last year, he expressed support for permanent membership for India. France and UK are among those who had declared support for India very early on in this process. And again, from a large number of countries, we have support. So we are engaged with this effort. And our aim would be that people see the reality that is there. And for effectiveness of the Security Council itself, it is necessary that there is proper representation there.
You talked about both Indian and American digital technology. Are there any solely American or solely Indian technology companies that you feel can benefit from the strengthening of the Indian-American alliance? If so, how do you feel that they could do so?
With the Indian economy increasing 7.6% and innovation for technology allowing India to be able to go all the way to Mars, what major idea does India have in store next? Also, what opportunities will there be for technological partnership between the U.S. and India in the future?
Hi, I was recently at the Commission for the Status of Women, in March, and I was an NGO representative. What is India doing to help the empowerment and the lessening of violence against women and young girls, and how can the United States do the same?
Thank you. Let me again take those three very, very distinct questions. First, in terms of digital technology, there's cooperation across a whole range of companies, and I'll just mention a few facts and figures that will highlight for you. The second largest number of Facebook users in the world are in India after the United States. The largest number of WhatsApp users in the world are in India. So this should capture for you what is happening and again the potential that exists. In terms of technology partnerships, I think it's in a whole range of sectors. I mentioned to you renewable energy, and that's an area where we are going to put a lot of emphasis, where we need more to be done in India. US companies are involved in that effort, and we'd like more to happen. Solar, wind, nuclear, other aspects. Again, digital technology would be a very important area. Defense technologies, because they also have other spin-off effects. That would be an important area. But across a whole range of sectors, for example, in automobiles, General Motors just announced some weeks ago that they're going to put in an additional $2 billion of investment in India. Ford announced that they're going to put in $1 billion of additional investment in India because they are looking at opportunities. Qualcomm announced that they're going to put in $150 million to support startups in India in the sector they are interested in. So there is a whole range of sectors where this is happening. In terms of the question related to women's empowerment, very often I describe to you that India is a very complex country. And the people say that very often what you say about India and the opposite of that both tend to be true. So in some ways we have challenges in India related to empowerment of women. But at the same time, if you see, we have already had a woman president, a woman prime minister, several women speakers of our parliament, several women judges in our Supreme Court, women CEOs. So in terms of achieving or breaking through glass ceilings, in India, we have been broadly at par with most countries in the world. We also have 30% reservation for women in local elected bodies. So not at state legislature, not at federal legislature, but below that, at other elected bodies. And more than 1 million women hold elected positions as a result of that. And that is again having an impact in terms of how they impact on their families and society. Having said this, we also face problems in terms of access to education, in terms of violence directed at them. And there are various legislative and other measures that are being taken. In terms of the education of the girl child, there are specific provisions that have been made by the government. For example, in one state in Bihar, in India, in Bihar, the provision was that if you educate your girl child beyond a certain class, then the state government would provide some facilities for communication and other things. So there are various schemes. And then again, if you really look at facts and figures as they relate around the world, the problem of patriarchy is not present just in India. It's present in all societies in the world. And women everywhere are dealing with that. So I think we need to keep that perspective in view also.
Wonder if you'd address the interests of India in the South China Sea and what's happening there.
It's been a great honor to hear you speak today. Thank you for having all of us. My question has to do with how the people in this room, the people of the United States, can educate our friends and families about the cultural significance of India, the history of its artistic traditions, and how we as people can connect to each other on a human level, not just the business level or the technological level, but how we can keep the traditions of India alive and educate people in the United States about the rich tradition of Indian culture.
Ambassador, would love to hear your opinion about the possibility for a durable peace between India and Pakistan, given the very difficult situation, both politically and militarily, with the military controlling essentially foreign policy and continuing to promote aggression against India.
On the South China Sea, broadly our position is that we support freedom of navigation and we support the issues being resolved in the framework of international law. So that's how we've, in terms of cultural traditions and spreading awareness related to that. So at one level, the embassy and the consulates, of course, takes certain steps, spreading the information, bringing cultural delegations, artists, programs. There are many entities in the US also who sponsor various events. But I think the way to take it forward would be, one, to see whatever means, whatever technology we can employ to spread more information about Indian culture and traditions and to promote more exchanges. And I think aside from others, the Indian origin community here should take some lead and play a role. And so those who are in the hotel industry, please make sure your hotels display sufficiently about Indian culture and traditions. Those who are in the media can do similarly. Students can talk in the classrooms and parents can take some responsibility for that. And I think doctors in the clinics can put on some videos, displays of India's culture and traditions. So everyone, in their own way, please spread the information, please sponsor exchanges, and we'd be happy to be supportive. We have a Facebook page of the embassy. We have about 100,000 followers there. So please get onto the Facebook page of the embassy, and we put out information there on a regular basis. So that could also be useful. And then on the India-Pakistan issues, of course, in our diplomatic service and otherwise also we need to deal with this issue in some form or the other. But I personally directly handle this relationship for fairly long stretches. And I can tell you that I've seen across the years that the Indian leaders certainly want to move forward with Pakistan to build a relationship of cooperation, trade, and other exchanges. But it is very difficult to do that if terrorists and non-state actors are deliberately used against you by agencies of the state. And so that's the challenge we are facing, that there is terrorism sponsored against India by the agencies of the state. And we have found that at significant times when an effort has been made to advance the relationship, a major terrorist incident happens. And so in 2008, we made an attempt, then there was a big attack in Mumbai, 160 people were killed, several US nationals were killed at that time. The present Prime Minister made a visit to Lahore to visit the Pakistan Prime Minister in December. Within a couple of weeks of that, there was an attack on an airbase in India. So it's a challenge that we are dealing with. Clearly, there are entities in Pakistan who benefit from preventing a normalization of the relationship. But anyway, we are dealing with that challenge. And our attempt is to try and advance the relationship, which would be of benefit to the region and otherwise.
And so, Mr. Ambassador, we are becoming quite an interesting town. We are hosting lots of very interesting international events, and we're going to give you a token of appreciation for your appearing here as well. But where is it, Luke? Courtesy of Chase Saunders, who is one of the people spearheading this effort, we're bringing some incredible international soccer matches to Charlotte. So just recently announced Bayern München and AC Milan is in June. I've forgotten exactly the date, but this is a big deal. And so and Ambassador, what we're doing is we're working up to possibly a cricket match at Bank of America Stadium. That is actually our goal. And by the way, the ambassador is going to be here for a little while afterwards if you want to come up and say hello. He's got a couple of meetings, but he's generally here. With that, this is a certificate of appreciation. We're going to take the pictures afterwards. We'll let you go so that you don't have to watch us being filmed. But a certificate of appreciation for visiting with us. And you know, we consider the air in Charlotte to be incredibly pristine and incredibly valuable, but we will permit you to let the air out of this with no penalty if it helps you get it back to Washington. So thank you. Thanks so much.